In a recent video, I covered the destabilisation of Ukraine by US interference, including the leaked Nuland-Getty call, which proved that the Americans were organising Ukraine's post-Euromaidan political architecture. The Americans are not the only foreign player in Ukraine, of course. The other main one is Russia. In one sense, the invasion of Ukraine is a concession that Russia has lost the great game in Ukraine, the game of geopolitics played by world powers. As it stood, Ukraine would inevitably join the EU and NATO unless Russia took drastic action. A constitutional amendment in 2019 under President Petro Poroshenko had committed Ukraine to joining both of these supranational entities, and Ukraine had militarized extensively with the aid of Western powers over the last 8 years. Russia has repeatedly reiterated that this crosses its domestic security red lines, since it sees NATO as a hostile power that seeks the destruction of Russian influence and the Russian state. Of course, Ukraine is a sovereign, occasionally democratic country and has the right to join whatever alliance it wants. And this is where the debate has stopped in the West. We do tend to have a different opinion on sovereign democracies when they sovereignly decide something that's against our interests, of course. Just look at the backlash against Brexit from across the elites of the Western world. Many people believe to this day that the Leave referendum was the result of hacking by Russian agents. On the face of it, Russia had several large advantages over the Americans when it came to influencing Ukraine. The two countries share a large land border, their capitals are very close, their languages and cultures are very similar. Indeed, 17% of Ukraine is ethnically Russian at the last census in 2001, some 8.4 million people. This is a colossal minority, more than double the proportion of Scots in the UK. It is the persecution of this minority that Putin has claimed as his casus belli, or rationale for war, and I hope to explore this messy history in a different video. Russia has long been a shady operator in Ukraine. If the FSB has been less successful in the region than the CIA, it is not for lack of trying, but rather lack of cash. The US economy is 15 times larger than Russia's, and this fuels its funding of the vast majority of supranational bodies such as the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN. This is where the US derives its outsized geopolitical influence, and how it has been able to win the influence war over Ukraine's corrupt, oligarchic-dominated political system. The Russian approach to Ukraine has been rather old school. They appear to have employed an approach similar to the active measures of the Soviet period, famously exposited by KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov. Viewers may be familiar with the use of active measures-style infiltration of Western institutions by leftists or wokists, but it is a system of tactics that originated in the USSR and is still used by its successor, the Russian Federation. Let's break down how it works.
Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures.
Demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilisation.
So, demoralization, destabilization, crisis point, and normalization. Russia's active measures have been much more active in Ukraine than anywhere else, since this is the country's primary strategic foreign policy focus. In 2004, the presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko was left permanently disfigured after a failed poisoning attempt, with a laboratory-made dioxin, TCDD, similar to Agent Orange. This is widely blamed on Russia due to two main factors. Firstly, he was running against Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian candidate. Secondly, Russia refused to extradite one of the figures present at the suspected dinner event, Volodymyr Satsyuk, whose testimony was key to solving the case. It is entirely in character for the FSB to have attempted to assassinate a political rival. Enemies of the Russian regime are widely known to suffer from mysterious poisonings, including the polonium-210 poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko and the failed poisoning of double agent Sergei Skripal and 3 others with Novichok nerve agent in 2018. It appears to be used as a terror tactic to murder apostates, those who betray the regime. The assassination of Westerners is, as far as I'm aware, unheard of, but Russians and Ukrainians, such as Yushchenko, would appear to be fair game for the FSB. There is a great deal of debate concerning Russia's role in fomenting unrest in East Donbass and the Crimea. The Russian regime is known to fund a wide variety of different political and activist movements in foreign countries, since its primary aim is demoralization and destabilization. According to the active measures of the Soviet KGB, foreign countries should be subverted by a full-spectrum campaign to undermine civil society and national culture. We will discuss how the Russian Federation has inherited much of its predecessor's playbook. During the Cold War, active measures supported a number of well-known initiatives including anti-Vietnam War protests, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and the LGBT rights and civil rights movements. This happened not because the Soviets were keen on a world without nukes or a society without discrimination, but because they recognized that these splinter groups were effective at undermining the fabric of civil society in the West. It is likely that these types of active measures contributed to the incitement of unrest in East Donbass and triggered the creation of the 2 breakaway republics, following mass protests and conflict with the state security forces. In fact, it's more than likely we have the leaks. To understand this, there's an important cast of characters on the Russian side, who we should be familiar with in order to understand the subversion of Ukraine. Other than Vladimir Putin, the most important figure is probably Vladislav Surkov, Putin's main ideological thinker, right-hand man, and eminence grise. In 2016, a mass hack was published that revealed thousands of emails to and from Vladislav Surkov. While the vast majority of these are benign briefs and notes, taken together they reveal a picture of extensive Russian interference in the subversion of East Ukraine. I will quote extensively from the foreign report from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Quote, "The leaks capture the period when Russia was pursuing its Novorossiya New Russia project from 2014 onwards, aiming to break off southeastern Ukraine. When this failed, save for the statelets that had been established in Donetsk and Luhansk, the Kremlin switched to promoting a separatist movement within Ukraine, the end goal of which was its federalization. This campaign continues today. The end goal of the Kremlin's actions in Ukraine since 2013 has been to achieve political influence there and ostensibly to halt the country's movement westward, which could ultimately result in accession to NATO. On the overt level, this was done by the puppet statelets of Donetsk and Luhansk. At the covert level, Russia interfered in Ukrainian elections, organized and funded a pan-Ukrainian campaign for a soft federalization of the country, attempted to change Ukraine's constitution and establish an alternative center of power, and created an illusion of widespread support for these activities. All of these activities were enabled by the intrinsic weakness of the Ukrainian state, aided by corruption and a collapse of state authority. The Kremlin also relied on 2 types of local actors: ideological allies and paid collaborators. The working frameworks for subversion were chiefly developed by Ukrainians, many of whom fled to Russia after Euromaidan. They had an insider's view of the Ukrainian mind and knew the weak spots to aim for. In effect, Russia's activity in Ukraine is a reinvention of active measures, a form of political warfare pioneered by the Soviet Union. The strategy for these active measures is closely linked to a concept known as reflexive control, a Soviet top-secret technique to manipulate an opponent into making decisions leading to their own defeat. The leaked emails are therefore a unique contribution to the international debate over how the Kremlin curates its managed conflicts. In analyzing these emails, this paper also forms part of a wider debate about how authoritarian states use freedom to undermine free or partially free societies. And they continue discussing Russian hybrid warfare. A 2012 article on soft power by Russian President Vladimir Putin is also useful, as it not only demonstrates his personal recognition of the importance of hybrid warfare, but also indicates his belief that Russia and the USSR had itself been a victim of it. There were 4 stages in Soviet-era active measures: demoralization, destabilisation, bringing the situation to a crisis point, and renormalization. Today, this appears to have evolved into a 6-stage model under current Russian military thinking: hidden genesis, escalation, beginning of conflict actions, crisis, resolution, and restoration. However, the basic principles remain the same. One of the main architects of this expanded doctrine of Russian subversion is believed to be Valery Gerasimov, the current Chief of the General Staff, Deputy Defense Minister, and in some ways head of Russia's armed forces. This is also known as the Gerasimov Doctrine as a result. They continue. According to the research underpinning this paper, Russia's tools for contemporary political warfare include information and disinformation campaigns, espionage, the use of fake documents and false evidence as part of a highly sophisticated form of psychological manipulation, support for paramilitary groups, the use of political fronts, assassination, and the collection of blackmail, compromat. However, Russia has gone beyond the political subversion practiced as part of Soviet active measures to create a more strategic, integrated approach to influencing and undermining other countries, one which draws on all the levers available to the state, not just the political ones. Indeed, it is possible to identify more than 50 tools of Russian influence which can be broadly categorized in 7 areas. Politics and political violence, the tools formerly associated with active measures and updated for the 21st century, as outlined above. 2. Soft power and governance, including religion, culture, law, and art. 3. Economics and energy, including transit fees, soft loans, gas supply, and seizure of assets. 4. Military power, everything from military exercises as a precursor to invasion to the provision of logistics support to paramilitary groups, to special forces operations and conventional military operations. 5. Diplomacy and public outreach, including state diplomacy, use of Western PR firms, and non-traditional public outreach. 6. Information and narrative warfare, including the use of Russian state outlets abroad such as Russia Today. 7. Command and control, the heart of the proposed framework." End quote. Russia tailors its strategy to the target. Its involvements in the West are comparatively limited, whereas in Eastern Europe it is far more active. They continue. In the former Soviet republics, where the Kremlin's degrees of infiltration and opportunities for intervention are greater, it uses a broader range of tools, including aggressive political blackmail, economic threats, the manipulation of ethnic or other groups loyal to Moscow, and the use of violent proxy groups, as in the Donbass, where Russia's special forces have also been deployed and are training proxy groups. In Ukraine, Russia has used almost all the tools available to it, ranging from conventional and special forces military support, under a fig leaf of deniability, through to economic, political, informational, governmental and diplomatic and public outreach tools. The situation in Ukraine clearly demonstrates that military activity is only one element of a spectrum of tools of Russia's grand strategy. An example of the fake reality it has created for the Russian population is the narrative that fascist Ukrainians are attacking Russians in the Donbass region. This narrative has proved powerful in mobilizing Russian popular support, and also in making it extremely difficult for Russians to oppose the Kremlin's actions without being seen as pro-fascist or pro-Nazi. I should also point out here that there are confirmed neo-Nazi paramilitaries active in Ukraine. However, their prominence in Russia has been overstated. The emails were leaked in 3 groups called tranches, and tranche 3 of the leaked emails highlights another key and related vulnerability of Ukraine that was exploited by the Kremlin: the willingness of some Ukrainians, whether for ideological or pragmatic reasons, to advance Russian interests and support Russian soft power operations in their country. Ideological collaborators were often sympathetic to the ideas of the Ruski Mir, the expansion of the Russian world, in conflict with the decadent Western civilization known as Gay Europa, beyond Russia's borders to wherever Russian speakers may live. And this just shows how the diversity and inclusion movements of the West undermine the credibility of Western ideas, including liberal democracy, abroad. While the relative success of these ideas in southeastern Ukraine can be partially attributed to the operations of Russian agents, such as Dmitry Soin, they fell on fertile ground that had been prepared through the soft power influence of Russian culture projects and arguably Ukraine's status as the junior partner in its relationship with Russia. Had Ukraine pursued a more vigorous state-building policy during the 23 years between gaining independence and the outbreak of war, the covert operations conducted against it might have been considerably less effective. So that analysis of the Surkov leaks should give an overview of the Russian problem. According to the RUSI analysis, Russia has its tentacles everywhere, particularly in Ukraine. From covering Russian active measures, I noticed that there is a distinct difference between Russia's activities in the West and its meddling in Eastern Europe. The engagement with the West is more limited and much less successful. As Callum covered on a premium book club recently about active measures, Russia's attempts to set up troll farms to flood the Western discourse with propaganda and disinformation have been undermined by sheer incompetence, poor grasp of English, and the high background level of mainstream media misinformation in which we live. While the Russians certainly attempted to influence the 2016 US election and the Brexit referendum, their actual efforts were clumsy and limited in success. It would be wrong to hold Russia responsible for the outcomes of these plebiscites, since its espionage efforts contributed so little to the outcome. In Ukraine, however, the Russians engaged in a no-holds-barred espionage and influence campaign to achieve foreign policy objectives. In former times, that consisted of supporting the pro-Russian regime of President Viktor Yanukovych, even to the extent of poisoning his electoral rival, Yushchenko. Yanukovych was already at the forefront of an immensely effective political machine that, like seemingly all Ukrainian political parties, combined unassailable campaign power structures with pervasive criminality and corruption. Following Yanukovych's ouster in the Euromaidan coup of 2013 to 2014, supported by Ukraine's neo-Nazi minority and allegedly the US State Department, the priority of the Russian FSB pivoted sharply towards engineering a managed conflict in Ukraine, similar to the conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They thus supported separatist unrest across East Ukraine, in the region formerly known as Novorossiya in imperial times, or New Russia. There were already fertile grounds for such unrest, since the Ukrainians had instituted a number of laws aimed at relegating the prominence of the Russian language and arguably turning Russians into second-class citizens of the country. This legislative de-Russification continued and intensified leading up to the present day, but that is a story for another time. Russia created a crisis and sent its own troops and agents to support separatist movements in East Donbass, while simultaneously seizing the Crimea in a stunningly effective coup de main. Yet they failed in East Donbass. The region became a bleeding ulcer for both Russia and Ukraine as the pro-Western regime under Yatsenyuk sent in the troops to quell all opposition. When Russia seized the Crimea, they confirmed the occupation with a referendum that confirmed the willingness of the local citizenry to join Russia. This referendum has been widely criticized as rigged, but the defection of half the Crimean garrison to Russia at this point and the large Russian population of the region indicate that this plebiscite may have been reflective of the popular will. Russia's active measures may have worked. Nonetheless, this move sent shockwaves through Ukraine and Europe and precipitated a long process of NATO-backed militarization of Ukraine. During the 8-year limited war in East Ukraine, which may have killed an estimated 15,000 people and displaced many ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, Ukraine militarized. When Russia seized the Crimea in 2014, Ukraine only had 6,000 troops in a state of combat readiness, out of a total military strength of 157,000, including reservists. By 2018, they had expanded their army to a whopping 250,000 men under arms, trained and equipped by NATO. At the start of the Russian invasion, Ukraine boasted 200,000 active duty soldiers with a further 900,000 reservists. And in a monumental failure of Gerasimov's hybrid warfare, these soldiers appear to be quite prepared to fight.